actually, the roots of Christmas actually go back to Saturnalia, which is a very, very old holiday where you were hosting or you were celebrating the god of the harvest. It was usually celebrated around December 17th. It was characterized by lots of fun. There was lots of partying, there was gambling, there was promiscuity, there was drinking, there was dice, there was feasting. It was a real event. There was also a sense of role reversal where you began to challenge authority and where whoever was a man would dress as a woman that day or vice versa. And you'll see this come back again, so that's why I mention it. It also has roots in the Persian celebration of the sun god. This is called Mithra, and oddly enough, that was celebrated on December 25th. The Persian religion of Mithra was monotheistic, so similar to Christianity in that way. There was a baptism associated with it, and they did believe in life hereafter, but women were not included at all, which I think is kind of interesting. It was a very male-dominated event. So in the newly formed Christian religion, that was actually a really cool picture, the one up on top that says Alpha and Omega. That is from the 4th century in Italy. And so you can begin to see that it's the iconography is coming out of Jesus. So you begin to see this, the iconography of the Christian religion coming through. But in the early years of Christianity, it was often difficult for you to worship openly because you could be persecuted for it. So this was one of the reasons why they were having a somewhat hard time finding some converts. So the early Christians thought, well, maybe what we could do is take the fun celebrations of Mithra and Saturnalia, put a Christian veneer on the top of it, and change people from worshiping the sun god, Mithra, to the Son of God, Jesus, and maybe we could make them converts as well. And it sort of worked. People were willing to become Christian, but they weren't willing to give up the party. And so what you see is this is the beginning of that pull between the secular and the sacred at Christmas time. And this was also probably the beginning of the lawn signs. Maybe they had the ancient lawn signs that said, "Keep the Christ in Christmas." I don't know. So now we're going to fast forward about 1,000 years, and this is the 1500s, and by this time, Christmas has settled in as a convivial holiday with good food and good drink. This is a poem from Thomas Tusser, who wrote in the 1500s, and he says, "At Christmas play and make cheer, for Christmas comes but once a year. Good bread and good drink, a good fire in the hall, brawn," which is like a head cheese, "pudding and souse," also a meat head cheese kind of thing, "and good mustard withal. Beef, mutton, and pork, shred pies of the best, pig, veal, goose, and capon, and turkey well dressed, cheese, apples, and nuts, jolly carols to hear, as then in the country is counted good cheer." So you can see it was all about the food and the drink during this period. And this isn't a surprise because this is December, and historically December was the time when your harvest was complete, your wine or your cider had been made, your larder was full, and if there was any time to feast, this was it. So now we move into the New World because Christmas has crossed the ocean as well. As a matter of fact, the first eggnog was consumed in Jamestown in 1607. There's a little tidbit that you can use at a party this year at Christmas if you want to. On the left-hand side, we have a quote from John Rolfe about what he saw in 1609. Christmas, and now remember, this is Virginia. So Christmas among the savages, we were never more merry, nor fed on more plenty of good oysters, fish, flesh, wild fowl, and good bread, nor better fires in England than in the warm smoky houses of Cape Cowton. But this is down south, and down south was primarily populated by Anglicans, and Anglicans, we will see, were much more willing to celebrate Christmas than the folks up north. The visitor at the home of William Fitzhugh in 1680 said there was good wine and all kinds of beverage. There was a great deal of carousing, 3 fiddlers, a jester, a tightrope walker, and an acrobat who tumbled around. Now that's a party. So by the mid-17th century now, what you find is that Christmas is in full swing from the beginning of December all the way until the beginning of February. It begins with St. Nicholas Day on December 6th, includes Christmas on the 25th, the feast of St. John the Apostle and Evangelist on the 27th, New Year's and the circumcision of Jesus on the 1st, the Epiphany on the 6th, and the purification of the Virgin on February 2nd. So you got a lot of time to be feasting and partying with people. And it became quite an event, especially in the 12 days between Christmas and New Year's. Gender, age, and class were all flipped upside down, much like it was during Saturnalia. Women acted and dressed like men acted and dressed like women. Young pretended they were old, old pretended they were young, and people who were people who were poor pretended they were rich. I'm not sure how much the people who were rich pretended they were poor, but nonetheless, they also began to challenge authority, and people who were common would pretend that they were royal for the day. So if you look at this picture from 1668, you see that they're all carousing and having a lovely time, but you see that guy over on the right-hand side? He's wearing a crown. And what he's doing is that's the symbol of I'm trying to be who I'm not. He's really not the king at all. It's just part of the whole role reversal that was going on at Christmas time. To this day, by the way, British officers serve the enlisted men on Christmas Day as part of that tradition that's carried down. You also had mumming and wassailing. So mumming carries that same theme through where everybody's getting all dressed up, lots of drinking and debauchery. The picture on this side shows that in the 17th century outside a house in England somewhere. And wassailing is a whole other story. Wassailing, we think of it as something lovely. Here we come a-wassailing among the leaves so green, right? It's very nice, it's very pleasant. Well, it really wasn't. Wassailing had an aggressive edge. Basically, if you were a young man, you'd gather with a group of your friends, you would go out carousing for the night, you would start going to people's homes, rich people's homes, knocking on their door, and demanding food and drink from them. It was sort of like trick-or-treat on steroids, except what you had was if you didn't answer your door, they might knock your door down so that you would come to it. So where we've got that here, we come a wassailing story. Here's another song that I don't know the melody to, but the lyrics are, and if you don't open your door, we will lay you flat upon the floor. So there was definitely an aggression that was going on with wassailing. So they began to realize that we needed to sort of tone this down somehow because it was getting a little bit out of hand. And they had more luck in America than they did in England. The Puritans are coming right around this time, and they settle in Massachusetts, as you know, and Governor Bradford decides Christmas is outlawed for the most part. That in 1621, which is only a year after it arrived, if you were not working on Christmas, you were ordered back to work. There was no excuse for your not working at Plymouth on those days. The Puritans believed there's no historical basis for Christ's birth on December 25. You're not going to find it anywhere in the Bible. If God wanted us to celebrate Christmas on that day, he would have given us a good reason to celebrate it on that day. And it really, and they were right on this one, it's sort of just a pagan holiday with a Christian veneer. So what you began to see was a pulling back of Christmas, both here in the United States as well as in England. In fact, in 1659, they went so far as to formally say Christmas is out. And that says, if I can read it, the observation of Christmas having been deemed a sacrilege, The exchanging of gifts and greetings, dressing in fine clothing, feasting, and similar satanic practices are hereby forbidden, with the offender liable to a fine of 5 shillings. Bet you didn't know gift giving was a satanic practice. This is Increase Mather, whose father was Richard, son was Cotton, very influential minister during that period. And he said, the generality of Christmas keepers observe that festival, after which a manner is highly dishonorable to the name of Christ. They are consumed in compotations, which is drinking in excess, interludes, don't need to tell you what those are, in playing at cards, in reveling, in excess of wine, and, God forbid, in mad mirth. Mad mirth. I wonder what that looks like. So you can see that it was not really well liked in the New World. It was almost as if the Grinch had stolen Christmas. But, like the Who's in Whoville, it didn't stay gone for long. By the 1730s, Christmas has begun to make a return throughout the colonies, and by the 1760, it's sort of as if the taboo has been lifted and everybody can start celebrating again. This picture is a photo of the holiday party at Mount Vernon in 1796. You can see George standing there in the background with his hand up. Well, the party is celebrating around him. So let's look at some of the changes that occurred between 1730 and 1760. First, you begin to see Christmas hymns coming back. One of the first songs, Songs of the Angels at the Nativity of Our Blessed Savior, first appeared in Nicholas Brady's 1700 supplement to the new version of the Psalms of David, which was published in 1696. So it was right around 1600 where, all right, so maybe we can begin, or 1700, when we can begin to start singing about it in a sacred manner in a church. By 1760, after that taboo was sort of lifted, and this was nothing that came out and said that, it just sort of was the way people reacted. It was a cultural change. Between 30 different Christmas songs were published in New England in that short period of time, many of which we still sing today. Another sure sign was the almanac. Now, there were lots of almanacs back then. Today we only think of one almanac, the Farmer's Almanac, but there were tons back then. This one is Richard Ames, but by 1730, you're beginning to see some of the almanacs mentioning Christmas as December 25th. But this Nathaniel Ames guy was a holdout. He refused to talk about Christmas in his almanac until, guess when? 1760. And then he says, this is a time for joy and mirth when we consider our Savior's birth. So it really, once he was now saying December 25 is Christmas, it opened up the opportunity for everybody to start talking about Christmas. So once again, we have that pull now between what's happening secularly and what's happening on a sacred way. You have the food and feasting and wassailing and drinking that goes on from a secular standpoint, and then from the Christian standpoint, it's all taking place in the church. Now, it was meant different things to different people and different religions. So the Quakers, for example, wouldn't celebrate at all. As a matter of fact, there was a quote from the Quakers that said, there should be no more baking of bread for the Christmas festival than on any other day, and that there should be no Christmas porridge on Christmas Eve. So in other words, same old, regular old day. Nothing's going on Christmas. The Presbyterians were not exactly in favor of Christmas, and because I think they were not ready to go for those celebrations, but they began holding church services on Christmas Day when they found that a lot of their flock were heading to the Anglican churches. They thought, uh-oh, we better have our own. The Dutch New Yorkers celebrated, but in a religious way. And the Popish Roman Catholics and those Anglicans were just having a right old party. There were some gifts that were given. It was generally time off, cash tips, sweets, or alcohol. It was usually given by parents to their children or masters to their slaves or to their domestic servants. And one of the things that I found interesting was they said that they would often give time off to their enslaved workers, and they would give them alcohol, with the idea being that you have time off, but if you give them alcohol, they're going to be happy to drink at the house and they're not going to leave your property. So it was it was a lovely gesture, but it had underlying meaning to it as well. Decorations varied really based on what part of the country you were from. There really are no sources that are written that say this is how to decorate your home. Today, you go into Barnes & Noble, you can find 1,000,001 books on it. But back then there was nothing, and so we can only look at a couple of prints that are available to get a sense of what they might have done. And if you look at these pictures, they're a little dark to tell, but you can see in some of them there are things hanging from the top, decorations hanging from the top, either mistletoe or perhaps some evergreens of some sort. The one on the left-hand side, that's probably a wassail bowl in the middle there. You can see up on the top, there are just vases that are filled with either holly or some sort of evergreen. And then the one on the bottom right, what I find fascinating and impossible to do because I've tried it, is you take little sprigs of holly, like a little 3-leaf thing of holly, and you stick it in the mullions in your window. And you do that. And look at how neatly those are all lined up in that window way in the back there. Very hard to do. I've tried it. We've tried to decorate the Nathaniel Crane house with that way, and we've even tried it with Scotch tape and it doesn't stay up. So I don't know how they pulled it off. Food and drink also varied depending on where you were from. Wine, rum, brandy punch, hams, goose, beef, turkeys, oyster, mincemeat pies. Remember, the harvest is complete, your larder is full, let's have a party, was basically the philosophy. So by the late 1700s, we find that it's many things to many people, but it's certainly not the domestic holiday that we think of today, and it's definitely not child-centric. It wasn't commercial either. And then there's a book by a gentleman named Jock Elliott who refers to this period, 1823 to 1848, as the Big Bang of Christmas. And most of the traditions that we know of and think of today as those old traditions happened during this period in a really relatively short time. We got Santa Claus, we got shopping, we got the Christmas tree, we got Christmas giving, and we got Christmas cards, all in about a 30-year span of time. So why did all this come to be? Well, the early 1800s, there was a time of unrest. Following the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, the government was in debt. By 1819, there was the panic. That was sort of the beginning of the boom and bust that you find in modern economies. A lot of people were out of work. There were foreclosures. It was a rough time. And with that rough time, people began to become more rowdy, become more demanding of people who had, so that you could see a bigger disparity in the social classes, and there was beginning to be some unrest, civil unrest. So this time, the writers got involved, because we all know that the pen is mightier than the sword. So they took matters into their own hand, and the first one was a gentleman named John Pintar. Now, John was the founder of the New York Historical Society, who, as their patron saint, used St. Nicholas. He was also the founder of the first savings bank in New York. He not only helped to establish Christmas in the way that we think of today, but he also helped establish Columbus Day, Washington's birthday, and July 4th as holidays. And basically the philosophy was, if we resurrect some of these old traditions, even if they're really not old traditions, then maybe we can make everybody live in harmony and peace once again. So at this point, the Dutch in New York were also seeing a renewed interest in some of their Dutch customs. So St. Nicholas came over and sort of took on a precedence at that point that he hadn't in the past. This picture is from a 1810 broadside that he produced for a dinner at the New York Historical Society. And if you look at the gentleman, St. Nicholas up there. He's got that long white beard that we'll see again with Santa as he begins to evolve. The next guy who came in was Washington Irving, and he first published Knickerbocker's History in 1809, and in it he talks about St. Nicholas as being the patron saint of New York City. He revises it in 1821 and adds some new additions. He talks about St. Nicholas, and he says, he's riding over the tops of trees in that self-same wagon wherein he brings his yearly presents to children. Ah, Santa's coming around. The smoke from his pipe spread like a cloud overhead. When he had smoked his pipe, he twisted it in his hatband and laying a finger beside his nose, gave a very significant look. Then mounting his wagon, he returned over the treetops and disappeared. So there's the beginning of Santa. Well, Clement Seymour, he was a very serious poet, believe it or not. And the legend goes that the day before Christmas, he lived up in the Harlem area, on a farm up in the Harlem area, and he was driving down to the city, which refers to the lower Manhattan, to buy a Christmas turkey, and he theoretically wrote this poem as he was on his sleigh. And he was ashamed of it. It wasn't one of his best efforts because he was indeed a real serious poet. And so he wouldn't allow it to be published under his name until 1844. But there is some question as to whether it really was Clement Seymour who wrote that poem. There's a gentleman named Henry Livingston who lived up in Poughkeepsie, and his descendants have made the claim for years that Livingston should get the credit for "'Twas the Night Before Christmas" or "A Visit to St. Nicholas." He wrote in much more lighthearted meter, "'Twas the Night Before Christmas" and "All Through the House." And it was much more of his style. And Joe Klein, who was the Times columnist and wrote Primary Colors that was published a number of years ago, he has a whole expose on this and ultimately concludes that it was Livingston that was the writer. Whoever, what we know is that "'Twas the Night Before Christmas" contributed to our modern Santa appearance. His appearance is chubby and plump, check. Twinkling eyes, dimples, rosy cheeks, round little belly. It happened on the night before Christmas. Now remember, this is when Christmas was still celebrated over the span of a number of days or weeks. He had 8 reindeer and a sled. That hasn't changed. He comes down the chimney. It's located in the home. It's not out on the streets. The audience, children, and the mood is, don't worry, there's nothing to dread. This is all lovely. It's great. So this really was, in a sense, a reframing of Christmas. Because when you think about it, the clatter outside is nothing to fear. So in other words, it's not the rowdy folks out there wassailing at your door. It's just Santa or St. Nick. It's limited to one night, so we don't have to worry about this carousing going on for weeks and weeks on end. We're bringing gifts rather than taking things from your home. There's a real focus on the children, and it's a family affair. So in a sense, that holiday that had been very not child-centric and very rowdy in some cases is now becoming a sweet domestic scene. And this goes back to, and this is the way it's always been, but it really wasn't. But that's what they were trying to make you think, so that was something that would calm the spirits, basically, or the people out there. So Santa has changed a lot, or St. Nicholas. That's the first one in 1858, not exactly a friendly-looking guy. This is Christmas furlough, so this is during the Civil War. You see Santa's wearing stars on his back. But he's got the long beard, and he's got a little pointy cap. 1864, he's wearing a yellow suit. Not quite Santa, but we'll get there. By 1888, he's being called Santa Claus and not St. Nicholas. That's an ad for sugar plums. He doesn't particularly look all that friendly. But then by 1881, you get Thomas Nast's version of Santa Claus. And he sort of set the stage for all of the Santas that we know of today. Thomas Nast was a German-born political cartoonist. He was an illustrator for Harper's Weekly. And interestingly, he also was the one who came up with the donkey and the elephant for the political parties. It was the origin of Christmas shopping, but it was very simple. It was with gift books. This was a huge fad in the second quarter of the 19th century. Up until then, the gifts were probably not store-bought. As I said, it was alcohol, it was sweets, it was time off, but it was rarely something that you would purchase. The gift books were elegant. They were watered silk or embossed. They had these presentation pages on them so that you could write something to a loved one on it. It was a way that you could be intimate without being overly intimate if you wanted to give something to someone that you were wooing. There were books for children. There was a lot of cross-pollination between them, so one Christmas book would refer to another Christmas book, so you'd want to buy the different ones. So in a sense that these were some of the very first presents that people were giving. And that pretty much ended by the time of the Civil War. I guess people had other things that they were dealing with, but the commercialization of Christmas was just beginning. Christmas tree is another fad, or not fad, but tradition that started up back then. The story goes that the German immigrants brought it in during the 1800s, and that's possibly true. It didn't become a custom in Germany until the 1830s, and it was in a very localized area, so it could be, but it was also probably the spread, that it spread to other places through writers. Once again, the writers are shaping Christmas for us. These are all Unitarian abolitionists, and they found a lot going in this whole, they found a lot that they liked in this whole idea of Christmas as a domestic holiday. The Unitarians had a different belief in child rearing than the rest of the world did at the time, or the rest of the United States did. They were much more into nurturing and teaching as opposed to strict discipline, and this was a nice way to do that, because if you were really good, you will be rewarded with something like Christmas. And so they sort of capitalized on this whole Christmas theme and the Christmas tree, and they began to write about it in some of their writings. It was also a way that they could get things out that weren't about abolitionism that was a little bit scary for them, or that were making people not really like them all that much. Whoops. And you can see that Harriet, one of them, Harriet Martineau, writes, and she was a British who came over and looked at this, and she says, "The room seemed ablaze and the ornaments were so well hung that no accident happened except that one doll's petticoat caught fire." Okay. "There was a sponge tied to the end of the stick to put out any supernumerary blaze. The children poured in, but in a moment every voice was hushed. Their faces were upturned to the blaze, all eyes wide open, all lips parted, all steps arrested. Nobody spoke, only Charlie leaped for joy." So the common features as Christmas trees began to spread was that they were usually on the table. They could be put up anytime between Christmas and New Year's. There were gifts that hung on the tree branches. Candles lit the tree, and it was usually a surprise for the children. The parents didn't put it, the children and family didn't put it up. It was something that the parents did, and then the kids came in and saw it. Fait accompli. This I find really funny. This is a picture of Victoria and Albert in their home at Windsor in 1848. Now remember, he was German, so it's very possible that there was that tradition. She brought this; she was enamored by it. And look at that lovely scene. Well, and you can see he's wearing his sash there. 2 years later, it winds up in Godey's Ladies' Book in America. It's titled "An American Family." Exact same picture. His sash has become a vest. Her crown is off, and she's now just got flowers on her hair. But basically, it's the same exact picture. It's also when the season of giving began. Ebenezer Scrooge A Christmas Carol was published in 1842. Charles Dickens supposedly wrote it in a very, very short time, about 10 weeks, working feverishly. He felt this was his way to talk about the evils and injustices of the world. But it was an instantaneous success, but he wound up losing money on it. It really began to show that there was this dichotomy between the rich and the poor, and the rich should be doing something about it. The Children's Aid Society was founded in 1853, and By 1890, you begin to see the Salvation Army Santas ringing their bells. 1890, they've been around that long. Pretty incredible, huh? Makes you want to throw another dollar in. Christmas cards also began to be during that Big Bang period, 1843 in England. It took a little bit longer to come to America. That didn't happen until about 1874 when American publisher Louis Prang began publishing them in Roxbury, Massachusetts, near Boston. He was a lithographer, and they were 8 colors, beautiful, beautiful pieces of artwork. And they began to spread, and that's the origin of the Christmas cards. So by the end of the 19th century, what you find is the transformation of Christmas is complete. What started out as the wassailing, carousing, rowdy holiday or heavily feasting, parent-centric holiday has now become a lovely domestic scene where you're giving presents and everybody is in a wonderful domestic bliss. You also have Hanukkah now starting to be celebrated around this time. In the Jewish religion, Hanukkah is a very minor celebration. There are no work restrictions, there are no food restrictions, but by 1900 you begin to see millions of Eastern European Jews coming into the United States, and so this was sort of a way for them to Americanize their holiday. Instead of giving the traditional gelt, which are the little gold coins that are filled with chocolate today, you would get presents so that you weren't falling too far behind your Christian friends. And so and the lighting of the menorah carries on that theme of light that we see with the Yule log and the Christmas tree, and even back further than that. By the 50s and 60s, Hanukkah has moved into the schools, and you're beginning to see more and more towns celebrating lighting the Christmas tree and the menorah at the same time, particularly in areas with high Jewish populations. Kwanzaa is another holiday that's now celebrated in December. It was first created in 1966 by a professor of Africana Studies at California State University, who was always trying to revitalize the African American culture. It's a cultural holiday, it's not a religious holiday, so you'll find a lot of people celebrating both Christmas and Kwanzaa. It's truly a celebration of family, of community, and culture. And it is based on the 7 principles of unity, self-determination, collective work and responsibility, cooperative economics, purpose, creativity, and faith. So now that brings us to the 20th century. So in the 20th century, we begin to see some different things. The first Rockefeller Christmas tree was put up in 1931 by the workers that were there. The next year, there was no tree the following year, and then the next year the company put it up and has been putting it up ever since. That's that one. That's that one, that's Rockefeller. The one on the bottom was the first Christmas tree at the White House, which was in 1923. You begin to start giving cookies and leaving cookies out for Santa Claus in about the 1930s. It's a Wonderful Life. Yeah. That came out, I'm just trying to find that. That came out in 1946. The Bells of St. Mary in 46. Miracle on 34th Street in 47. Holiday Inn in 42. White Christmas in 54. Whew! Right? All the favorites right there. Okay, we got Frosty the Snowman, who came out in 1950. The Grinch in 57. Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer in 64, and A Charlie Brown Christmas, one of my favorite Christmas ones, 1965. Christmas trees began to change a little bit. You began to see artificial Christmas trees and aluminum trees in the period of the 1950s or 60s. Remember making those styrofoam balls where you stuck the things in them? That became really popular during that period. Favorite gifts were Slinky, Silly Putty, Tonka toys, televisions, Mr. Potato Head, loved him, Barbies, Frisbees, and the evolution continues. We have Black Friday. Guess what year Black Friday was first, the term was coined? This goes farther back than I thought it was going to be. 1966. I don't remember Black Friday back that far. It was coined by a Philadelphia policeman who was talking about the traffic congestion on the day after Thanksgiving. The movie Elf, that came out in 2003. The movie Polar Express, 2004. And the Elf on the Shelf. Everybody know this tradition? If you've got grandkids or kids, you might know this tradition. You have to, boy, am I glad my kids were done with this by the time we got there. What you have to do with the elf on the shelf is you move it every day, which shows you that the elf is watching and knows what you're doing at all times. And that came out in 2005, but really hit popularity, I would say, in the last 5 years or so. But yeah, the elf on the shelf, I would think is a little difficult for parents. And finally, internet shopping. That's new. I mean, we never had that Cyber Monday the way we do now. And things are still changing. Has anybody gotten the Jackie Lawson Advent Calendar online? Well, if you like Advent calendars, this is something to do. She does it every year. This is now about my 4th year getting my Jackie Lawson Advent Calendar. I send it to my kids. Everybody has their Jackie Lawson Advent Calendar. And every day you click on the day, just like you would on an Advent calendar, and you get like a lovely little animated scene, or maybe you have a game where you can decorate the wreath or the Christmas tree. It's loads of fun. It's not that expensive. But it's become, in my family at least, one of our favorite new Christmas traditions that we'd never done in the past. So while the real Christmas that we know of really started in the 1800s, it still is evolving today in many ways. And I hope that you'll take another Christmas tradition and come and see us this year. We're always decorated at both of our houses. The Garden Club of Montclair does a phenomenal job at the Crane House and Historic YWCA. And Bartlett's Florist has been helping us in the last couple of years over at the Schultz House, where we have a collection of Molly Schultz's toys as well as the family's original decorations. And so we put them up around the house for people to come. These are the dates that are open, that were open every Sunday in December up until the last one, Christmas Eve, as well as Saturday for Essex County Holiday House Fair weekend. We also are doing 2 candlelight tours this year of the Crane House, which are fun. You'll hear a lot of what I've just told you at that tour, but basically we walk around, the house is all lit in candles, and I walk with a lantern, and we go room to room to room, and we talk about what was happening Christmas-wise during those periods. So lots of fun, and I hope to see you at Christmas time sometime at one of our properties. Thank you.